Hello, and happy Friday. I'm your host, as usual, Alex Cox, and welcome to another fantastic, well, I hope so, fascinating episode of Find My Past Fridays, our live weekly show about all things family history and all things interesting to family historians. I am flying solo this week because Max is not in the office. So please bear with me if we do have any technical slip-ups. I've got so many different items in front of me. I've got two laptops, an iPad. I can see your comments. I'm hoping you can all hear me. Can you hear me okay? Sound problems? No? I'm going to take that as a yes because we haven't had anyone saying otherwise. But yeah, no, it's lovely to be here even though I am on my own. But there are some positives to being on my own because Max does try and limit the amount of time I talk for, and as he's not here I can kind of run free, so to speak, and waffle on for as long as I like. Because this week I'm talking about one of my favourite record collections on the whole of our website, and it is a topic we've covered before, but I think it's so interesting, and this kind of research can be so rewarding that it's definitely worth revisiting and looking at in a bit more depth because we haven't talked about it for some time, and that is crime and all records related to crimes, prisons and punishment. And that's an area of English and Welsh family history, well, and other regions of the world as well, that I think Find My Past covers particularly well. We have some fantastic crime records, and we've got lots of little collections, but we've got one massive, fantastic collection from the National Archives, which is what I'll be talking mainly about today. But before I start, a little bit of a housekeeping. So yes, I'm on my own, but that's not to say that I cannot see your comments. We've also got my colleague Niall, who's in our Dublin office, who's a Facebook Live regular. You probably saw. We are the justice system as your family have had. They don't have to have been a perpetrator of a crime. As with our collection, you know, our collection doesn't just cover perpetrators; it covers victims and those working within the legal system as well. So yeah, let us know. Was your ancestor a black sheep? Were they locked away for some terrible offence? Were they a victim? Or did they bang the gravel? Were they the one sat up in the judge's chair sentencing people to transportation or execution? Let us know and get your comments in. We've already had quite a few in when Max posted the teaser for this week's episode, and basically the amount of comments we've had in already and the kind of examples people are giving, it's kind of proving a point I want to address later, which is that when you think about how English society, or British society, has changed over the past 300-400 years and how the nature of crime has changed, and the amount of people that pass through the justice system is staggering, and a lot of the offences they pass through for are, you know, things we cannot judge them too harshly for in this day and age. You know, back then there was no welfare state, there was no safety net if you fell on hard times, and many people did. Obviously the gulf between rich and poor was a lot wider than it is today, so many people would find themselves in, you know, situations where they had little or no alternative than to commit a crime, and you know, many of the crimes that were treated incredibly harshly are now things that you probably wouldn't even get a formal caution for, but we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But yeah, some examples we've had here, we've had Michelle Watson, who said, "Too many to name. My great-grandfather, who made the papers all over the country when a policeman chasing him fell through a roof into a privy. I suspect grandfather was stealing copper. I also had an ancestor transported to Australia as a child for stealing." Oh, these are great because it's all stuff I want to be touching on slightly later. And making papers all across the country, that's another good tip. The crossover between our newspaper collection and our crime records is very strong, and that is also something I want to be talking about later. So June Cobley said, "I'm very proud to have had two transported ancestors, one from each side of the family. I think both are in both are found in newspapers in your records." Yes, I'm sure they are. Henry Dother from Cumberland for larceny, theft, and William Kettleband, oh, that's a good name, from Nottinghamshire for supposedly killing his son Isaac. Wow, that sounds very dramatic. The newspaper results cover so much. Again, great example. So what you will see when I start talking about crime records is the incredible amount of detail you can often find when you're pulling these stories out. But when you combine that with searching newspapers, you know, the richness and the different layers of the story that you can uncover is often quite staggering. So I'll say one more comment before I start diving in. So Ruth Fairmason, one of our regulars, hello Ruth, said, possible ancestor was involved in a riot against the installation of a clergyman in 1823 in Inverness. Oh, I hope I said that right. I say possibly because the last record I've found, remember my Scots alias in England question for Miko. I can't, but I will look it back up and make sure it gets to Miko. So yeah, we've had some great comments in, and I will be looking at those in more depth a little bit later. And I can see we've had more coming in live. So Claire Falby said, Irish petty records are filled with my family, especially one family that had many issues with other family members. Ooh, a bit of a, was there a bit of a kind of clan rivalry there, inter-family fighting. Lots of drinking, verbal abuse, animal on the roads illegally. That's why I love Irish petty session records. Well, not just Irish petty session records from all over the show are just great because the level of crime they cover means that so many different kinds of people from all walks of life are in there. So another thing I wanted to say as well was, as Max isn't here, I'm afraid I can't bring up on screen live some of the wonderful examples I'm talking about, but if Niall is watching in the comments, he might be able to post a few links on my behalf and point you in the right direction. So remember, question of the week, we want to know what your family's connections to the criminal justice system were. Did they have brushes with the law? Were they victims of crime? Or were they enforcing the law? And I will try and read some out, but I just love seeing you all compare stories and sharing your discoveries with each other, because I think that's one of the nice things about these videos, that like-minded people can come and discuss their favourite hobby. So yes, before I talk about crime in more detail, I just want to remind you that as it is Friday, it means we've released a load of new records as it's Findmypast Friday, and this week is a particularly good week to have ancestors from Kent. That's right, the Garden of England, one of the home counties, because this week's releases were all themed around Kent. So we've had a whole host of new additions to our collections of Kent parish records. That's the baptisms, banns, marriages and burials. And these are transcripts that have come from the Kent Family History Society. Thank you very much, Kent Family History Society. And they cover a variety of parishes. So it's Burham, Canterbury, Deal, Dover, Gravesend, Halling, Hawkshurst, Higham, Kilndown, Lydd, Maidstone, New Romney, Tudley, Capel and Walmer from 1538 to 1988. And I know I read that out far too quickly for you to probably take that on board. So if you do want to find more, visit the Findmypast Friday, the latest record section, of our blog, where you will find our weekly Findmypast Friday blog, which will detail all the sets and give you a bit more information. We've also added over 35,000 new additions to our collection of Canterbury Archdeaconry registers. These cover the parishes of Hythe, Paddlesworth, Sandgate and Westgate, and span the years 1813 to 2001. And these are very interesting because they don't just contain transcripts, they contain lovely, beautiful scanned-in images of the original handwritten documents themselves, which often provide additional information. So we haven't just added new Kent records to existing Kent sets, we've also added 2 brand new record sets. So we've added a new collection of Kent Poor Law Union records, and this is a real mixed bag, very, very interesting. 16 different types of poor law records in here from 24 different unions across the county. So you'll find things like admissions, discharge registers, life event records, BMDs, relief lists, minutes from guardians meetings, all sorts. So if you think your ancestor fell on hard times or was involved in a poor law union in Kent, definitely have a look for them in there. And last but not least, we have also added a new set of Kent registers and records, which are basically assorted collections of interesting historical publications, which are really great, not just about finding out, but they're good for setting context. We've got them for a variety of counties across the UK and Ireland, I believe, and Scotland as well, actually. Just go to our A to Z of record search, type in your county, and see whether you find a collection of registers and records, and you'll find things like old printed parish records or local histories, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, lots of good Kent records. If you want to know more, visit the blog, and find out more about them there. And I'm just having a look. So Dot Shabbat said, hi, I'm here from Hartlepool. Chris Clare Felby said, happy about Kent Records, as I have quite a few ancestors from there. Well, I hope we keep you very busy this weekend. And Susan Riley has said she hasn't found anything in criminal records, but a few newspaper reports of a great-great-aunt being charged with allowing her house to be used as a brothel. Wow, enterprising. You know, you can definitely say that. Local archives have petty sessions documents for her and someone else, relieving a man of 17 shillings. Wow, I love hearing all these. Everyone wants a black sheep in the family, really, don't they? You know, I know some people might be a bit shocked or saddened to find that some of their ancestors were less than honest, but I think the general consensus of people I speak to are they love finding these stories because I think it just makes their family story a bit more interesting. I have tried. I haven't found any criminal ancestors yet. They may have just been really good at it and never got caught, but I have found an ancestor who was a victim of crime, which again is a good evidence to the fact that it's not just perpetrators in these records. So my 5 times great-grandfather, Joseph Jessup, who I've told you about before, he was the Crimean veteran who lied about participating in the Charger Light Brigade. He actually got there like 2 days after it happened, and obviously just got back to Liverpool and was telling tall tales in the pub. But we found a entry in one of the calendars of prisoners for a young man who'd broken into my great-great-great-great-grandfather's house and stolen 3 of his Silver War medals. And it didn't go into too much detail. It was more about the offender rather than my great-great-great-great-grandfather. But it was, you know, just a bit of an insight, a window into a moment of his life. You know, I'm sure as a proud veteran who lied about his service, he was probably very upset to lose these medals. So, yeah, it just made me understand a little bit more about his life and also explains why these medals are no longer in our family's possession. But yes, on to crime records. Why are they so fantastic? Well, not only because there's so many of them. So the main collection we have is our collection of England and Wales crimes, prisons and punishment records. So these were released back in association with the National Archives as their government records back in 2013, but ever since then there's been regular updates. The collection has continued to grow. Oh, just seen Denise Reaper, hello from Aberdeen, hello. And Ficy Howe saying a relative back in the day was sent to Australia on a ship called Guildford. RE something to do with sheep. Well, I think that was quite a common occurrence. But yeah, so back to the records. So I love this collection. It's just such a mixed bag. There's so many different types of document in there, and there's images of them all as well, and the level of detail ranges from, you know, brief entries in calendars of prisoners where you'll get basic biographical information, you know, a couple of lines on the offence they committed, maybe whether, you know, maybe they were sentenced, to things like, you know, communications between judges' reports on cases that go into incredible depth. You know, we found one for a young man who was executed for forging a £5 note. You know, which seems very drastic, but, you know, this was back in, I think, the late 1700s when £5 was a substantial amount of money, and it was viewed as a crime against the crown, because, of course, you know, it was the crown's money, they were minting it. But the report detailed everything, you know, from the evidence found when they raided his house to the paintbrushes and the types of paint that were used to forge these notes and why the judge wasn't going to ignore his petition for clemency. So, yeah, there's just so much different. There's just such a wide variety of amazing documents in there, and they come from all kinds of places. So you've got, you know, all kinds of different government departments. You've got records from the Home Office, the Prison Commission, the Metropolitan Police, the Central Criminal Court, also known as the Old Bailey, the Treasury, and the Admiralty as well, you know, because of course they cover transportations and prison hulks, which I will tell you a bit more shortly. So containing over about 5.8 million records now and counting. It may continue to grow in the future. It is one of the largest searchable databases of England and Wales crime and punishment records available anywhere online. So it spans 1779 to 1936, a really, really interesting period of British history. You know, it covers the Industrial Revolution, it covers rapid urbanisation, when people were leaving the countryside en masse and heading to the cities, and the way people fundamentally lived their lives and lived alongside each other was changing so quickly, and people, you know, society didn't quite know how to catch up. So that led to explosions in crime, and, you know, you've got this period of the criminal justice system called the Bloody Code, and this is all covered by these amazing records. So not only are they great for family history, they're great for social history and just British history in general. You know, it's a really interesting 157-year period that's covered by these records. And they cover such a wide variety of different offenders. You've got stories from the ordinary, ranging from the very, very ordinary to the absolutely extraordinary. From your Georgian highwaymen to Victorian murderers to Edwardian petty thieves to rural common poachers to unemployed food thieves to trade unionists, political activists. So much. You can tell how excited these records make me. They are definitely one of my favourite collections on the whole of Find My Past. And it's not just information as well that you'll find about your ancestors. In some of the series, there's 22 series in total, National Archives series, covered by this massive and very rich collection. Some of them, particularly some of the later ones, will also include mugshots. So you may even get to see the face of your ancestor staring directly back at you from the page. And some of these mugshots are amazing. You get mugshot books from Pentonville prison, where all the prisoners were holding up their hands, because of course so many people were working in heavy industry and dangerous roles that losing fingers was so common. It would often be used to identify people, and they might have tattoos on their hands. And looking at a lot of these fellas, you think, oh, they look hard. I wouldn't want to be locked in a cell with them. But yeah, so as I mentioned, there's a variety of different series covered by the Crime, Prisons and Punishment collection. If you want to know exactly what's included, go to the individual search page. Niall, if you could pop a link to the search page in the comments, that would be amazing. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, beneath the search form, on pretty much every search page we have, there's a section of the page which gives you all the contextual information. It'll tell you where the collection came from, a little bit of the history behind it. And with collections like this that encompass 22, say a wide variety of different series, you'll get a full list of every single series included, their reference, which will help you search for them more efficiently, and also what these series cover and what they include. But there are certainly, I mentioned before, you get things like petitions for clemency, which will be petitions sent in by family members. So, say if your ancestor was going to be executed and the local community didn't think they should, not only will you get, handwritten, heartfelt letters written by, say, their wife or their mother begging for mercy and explaining why they're not a bad chap after all, which gives you incredible insight into the kind of people they were and the relationships they shared with their relatives. But you may also get the names of all their friends and neighbours, which will be an incredible snapshot of the community they lived in, and you'll get all the names of the people who probably associated with them and cared about them in life, which is quite a special thing, I think. And as, of course, I mentioned, you get things like the judges' reports, but there are some series that you will be using more than others. And I'd say one of the most useful ones are calendars of prisoners. And there's loads of different series covering calendars of prisoners, and these date all the way back to 1787. That's when the earliest one is. So basically what these are their names of prisoners held in county prisons, awaiting trial at the quarter sessions, and assizes outside of London. So some calendars are pre-trial, and they'll note the name of the prisoner and the offence, and others are post-trial, which will tell you the verdict and the sentence. And of course, sometimes there were appeals and sentences were overturned. So just because you find, say, someone being sentenced to life, sentenced to death, doesn't mean they were necessarily executed. It's always worth checking to see if there are more records for them, and you might find that their sentence was commuted and they were transported to Australia. They're generally quite uniform, so they'll kind of be in a big grid. I wish I could get them up on screen to show you, but if you just do a search in the collection, they're probably one of the first type of documents that you'll land on. So they're like a kind of a list of inmates with loads of columns, almost broken up like a census form, and you'll have the name, and then you'll have their age, their profession, sometimes their level of education. It may also include the name of the magistrate who committed the case to trial. It'll give you the date of their arrival in prison, but most importantly and most interestingly, the details of the crime they committed, the names of their victims, and obviously in post-trial calendars, the conviction and the sentence they received. So you also, another series that you'll come across a lot as well, which are very similar actually to the calendars of prisoners, are prison registers. And I think there's about 86,000 of these in the collection, and they span from about 1860 to 1869. So they don't cover a wide period, but just seeing loads of comments come in. Which comments have photos? Brenda Stewart, I'm going to be telling you that very shortly. And Beverly Healy, hello. Thank you for joining us. The prison registers contain a little bit more information than calendars will. So they'll give you things like marital status, the number of children they had, as well as where they were received from, when and any previous offences they may have had. So there's less of them, but they're slightly more detailed. But what they also come with as well, which is really interesting, if you're you're a bit of a budding social historian, is statistical returns. So they'll tell you the demographic makeup of the prisons, and that can be very illuminating indeed. So in answer to Brenda Stewart's question, which documents have photos? Well, probably two of the most detailed and interesting series, I think, in the whole collection. I know I've been saying this about a lot of the series, but if you're lucky enough to find your ancestors in either PCOM 3 or PCOM 4, which are male and female licenses, and that's literally what they're called, female prison licenses, male female licenses, but if you pop the reference PCOM 3 or PCOM 4 into the series filter on the search page, it'll take you straight to them. These are a license, is effectively, well, a license to be at large. That's what it was. It was essentially a parole document. So these were the documents that would be created when your ancestor was leaving prison. And as a result, because the authorities wanted to keep tabs on them and, didn't want to just release them off into the wild, because who knows what the consequences could be, particularly if they're a very violent offender, these were very, very, very detailed, incredibly detailed. They're like individual case files on prisoners, men and women. So, but after 1871, obviously you don't get it much earlier because photography was still relatively new, but after 1871 they include mugshots, and yeah, they're just so detailed. They'll tell you things like, they'll give you all kinds of details about previous offences, prisons where your ancestor had stayed at before, if they fulfilled a role or an occupation in the prison, say if they were a carpenter and they helped out, doing carpentry in the prison, or they helped cook, you might find details of that in their file. All things that, help towards getting them their parole. Not too different to modern parole, I imagine. Not that I've ever been through, not that I've ever been through it, I promise. But they're super detailed. You'll find loads of details about their family members, their next of kin, their address, where they're going to be released from, where they're going to be released to. Because of course these files are primarily focused on where these people are going after release, and of course mugshots. So really, really, really interesting documents. Another honourable mention to ones with other documents with photos are the registers of habitual criminal. Sorry, I mumbled that. Registers of habitual criminals. These have the catchy series header of MEPO 6, MEPO 6, and basically these were files made by the Metropolitan Police of offenders who were constantly being hauled in. So they might have been alcoholics, they might have been prostitutes. These people are almost exclusively lower levels. Yeah, so they were used for that purpose, but they're very interesting and they'll give you all kinds of information. But they're just really fascinating to see the faces of these different types of individuals, and you can just tell by glancing at them that lots of them had very, very hard lives. And last but not least, another series I wanted to mention quickly was the Hulk registers, prison Hulk registers, because these are very useful, particularly if your ancestor was transported to Australia or Bermuda, as that was also a big penal colony. Not as well known as Australia, because it doesn't have quite the same legacy, but still lots of prisoners were sent there nonetheless. So prison hulks were basically floating prison ships. So when the population of English prisons started to explode, the authorities realised that they just didn't have space to cram these people in. So they used a tactic they developed during the American Revolutionary War, which was to convert old battleships into giant floating prisons that were docked in the Thames around Medway mainly, I believe. And yeah, some of these boats had quite illustrious histories. It's quite tragic to see how they ended up. So, HMS Bellerophon was a very famous prison hulk. And that was one of the big ships at the Battle of Trafalgar. And in it was Bellerophon's captain who took Napoleon's surrender in 1814. So, to have such a, to be involved in such a high point of British history and then, end up to this kind of dark, because the conditions on these hulks were bad. Disease was rampant. If you were, in many cases, getting sent to what was a death sentence. So it's quite sad that such an illustrious ship ended up, kind of being this floating, disease-ridden prison ship. But, you also had ones like the HMS Temeraire, which was also at Trafalgar, and is the subject of Turner's one of Turner's almost iconic paintings, The Fighting Temeraire. But towards the end of its life, it wasn't fighting anymore. It was docked off the Thames, and it was housing, poor prisoners shackled together, ridden with lice in appalling conditions. So, searching Hulk registers, there's an individual series in the crime collection for prison Hulks. We also have a separate individual collection, which is just prison Hulk registers. But you find some shocking records. Do you remember what I said earlier about people being transported for incredibly petty offences? So, here's an example. You find people like Thomas Abdi. That found a young man called Thomas Abdi, 18 years old, and he was sentenced to transportation for life in 1823 for the theft of a handkerchief. Quite a small offence, but he was shipped off to Australia for life just for stealing a handkerchief. And his case was far from unique, because if you see lots of life sentences for handkerchief theft. There was another guy called William Ball, 25, another guy called James Bennett, just 15. In fact, if you search for if you put handkerchief in the keyword and search by keyword using handkerchief, 400 results come back. That gives you an idea of how prevalent handkerchief theft was and how seriously it was being treated. So that leads me on to some observations I've made about the history of British crime and why these records are so interesting and what they show. And also, quick note to Niall, I have 2 laptops. The one that has the Facebook comments on has died. I've already run out of battery, so I can't currently see the comments coming in. If you'd be a star, Niall, and pop any ones you'd like me to read out, or particularly good ones, into the our comment channel, I will have a look once I've finished waffling about crime records. So these records do highlight how the criminal justice system evolved with industrialization, urbanization, and population explosions. So to give you an idea of how crime rates exploded, it did match when people were flocking to the cities. So in 1840. So in 1800, you had the government realised about 5,000 people a year were leaving the countryside for the cities in search of work. So that was in 1800. By 1840, that had risen to 20,000, and it kept on going up and up and up. And so many people were coming in so fast, the cities couldn't cope with this. So slums developed, and as a consequence, intense poverty arose, and that led to explosions in crime. And the ruling classes could see this happening and started to get very, very worried. And as a result, crimes against property were by far the most commonly prosecuted and probably the most commonly committed as well, to be honest. Things like larceny, theft and burglary continuously topped the charts during this period. Receiving stolen goods, forgery were actually appeared to be a lot more common than violent or destructive crimes such as murder, arson, shootings were virtually non-existent. And what you also see is the majority of offenders were young men, and most of them were committing petty thefts. And the most common offences committed by women were generally, victimless crimes, things like prostitution, vagrancy, being drunk and disorderly. One thing I did notice as well is domestic violence kind of never really made it before the courts. And I guess this is because it mainly stayed within the private sphere, and I might be, making a few assumptions here, but it was probably more prevalent among the working classes, so maybe wasn't policed or caught as much. And I think among other classes, publicising that sort of behaviour would have been regarded as bringing the family's reputation into disrepute. So you don't really, even though domestic violence would have been so much more prevalent than it is now, it was rarely prosecuted. So, as I was saying, crimes against property were treated a lot more severely than crimes against the person. And this is reflective of a period of British justice called the Bloody Code, which basically we were hanging everybody for pretty much everything. So, obviously, all European countries were executing people, but the British really did lead the way in hangings. I think we hanged more people than pretty much any other country. To give you an idea of how crazy this got. So in 1688, there were only 50 offences in the statute book that were punishable by death. But by 1776, that number had almost quadrupled, and by the end of the century, it was up to 220. So, in about a 200-year span, well, no less, a 100-year span, the number of executional offences have gone from 50 to 220. And this is largely seen by many historians, and I tend to agree, as a form of, class suppression. by the rich against the poor, because they were paranoid that, these unwashed, stinking masses that had flocked to the cities were going to start stealing their stuff out of desperation. And this is summed up very well by a guy called George Savile, who was the first Marquis of Halifax. And when asked about it by someone who said, "Do you think maybe we're executing too many people?" he said, "Men are not hanged for stealing horses, but that horses may not be stolen." And that sums up their attitude towards this totally. It was preventative. Hang a man for stealing a handkerchief. People won't steal larger items. And, to give you an idea of how severe this was, until 1823, grand larceny, so this was, severe theft, grand larceny was punishable by death. But what would you think grand larceny was? Well, until 1823, it was defined as goods worth more than 12 pence, and that was only 1/20th of the weekly wage for a skilled labourer at the time. So, you can see how easy it was to get executed. So we found so many examples of this, of, people who were given incredibly heavy sentences for very light offences. So we found an 11-year-old street child named Mary Wade. This is really tragic, this. 11 years old. And she was sentenced to death by hanging at the Old Bailey in 1788 for stealing clothes from another child. An 11-year-old sentenced to hang for stealing from another child. That almost sounds like some kind of playground incident or dispute, and this poor girl was sentenced to death. I believe her sentence was commuted, but still, they were willing to hang her. And then, as I mentioned before, Thomas Abdy, but another guy, we had a 22-year-old chap named Charles Biggs was sentenced to life for the theft of trousers, just stealing a pair of trousers. He was sentenced to life. You also had a 14-year-old boy named Richard Cooper who was transported for life, all on his own, not with his parents. Poor 14-year-old sent off his own, probably surrounded by a number of hardened criminals and quite frightening men, simply for stealing a piece of ribbon. That's all he stole. And one thing that was quite alarming was, while this did start to wind down during the 1800s, because I honestly think part of this is the reason that public executions fell out of favour, because Britain had this big history of, famous public executions. I think we were one of the only countries in Europe that allowed the executed to read a statement before they went, or the highwaymen, famous eulogies before they're executed. But it's more important as the crowds that are turning up, as they're starting to see more and more people getting executed for things they'd done. I imagine the appeals started to wane slightly. So who knows? That's just me throwing it out there. But this trend did continue until later on in the 20th century. So we found one really bizarre list of court cases from Essex in 1896 that showed a man named Mr. Charles Norton was sentenced to 9 months in Pentonville for stealing 5 cases of brandy, while on the same list, an errand boy named George Rourke was jailed for only 4 months for manslaughter. So Mr. Norton got a more serious assault than someone who'd killed someone, and mind boggles. I mean, many people still scratch their head at some of the sentencing that goes on in this country, but it was even weirder back in the day. So yeah, that was my whistle-stop tour of the interesting history of the criminal justice system in England and Wales, and how you can kind of see all these little moments from it popping up in our records. But before I finish talking about records and take a look at some of the comments you've sent in, do remember there's more on Find My Past than just the crime, prisons and punishment collection to help you find your criminal ancestors. As I mentioned, newspapers, an amazingly handy asset. You can find so much detail in there. But we've also got lots of individual collections, things like we've got prison registers from Manchester, Irish petty sessions. As one of the commenters said before, fantastic collection. We've got some great Australian collections of convict ship registers and transportation records. So go in our A to Z. Have a little look around. You'll also find a number listed on the useful links and resources section of the search page. So yeah, search crime records, and I'd love it if you could, even if you make some discoveries after this video, please post them on Facebook and let us know, because I love this set. I love hearing about when people have successes with them. They're just so interesting. So, comment time. Let's have a look what people have sent in. I believe Niall has been diligently popping some in the comment section. Loads. Oh, this is great. You can tell if Max was here, he'd already be tapping his watch going, "Stop, Alex, stop." Sorry, Max. Let's have a look. So, Jan Rocket has said, back in the 1870s, we had a chap who tried to quieten his children by poisoning them with laudanum. That's a bit extreme. He was tried at the Old Bailey and sent down for it. The children survived. Ooh, relief. To testify against him in court. Wow. So another good one from Sue Poley Eliza, one of our regular viewers, who said, my great-great-uncle worked with the US Secret Service. Wow, that's cool. He guarded 4 US presidents on trips to California. He was also called to New York to serve in finding a counterfeiter. He found the individual, a grandfatherly type, who passed off fake dollars in his neighborhood. A movie was made about the case called Mr. 880, and Uncle Arthur was technical advisor for the film. Sue, I think I'm going to have to find that online and give that a watch. That's incredible. And it's nice to actually, I mean, while it's lovely hearing about all these black sheep and rogues, it's quite nice to hear a story from someone on the other side of the law. That's a fantastic story. Thank you very much for sending that in. So we've also had Tracy Bedford, who said, I've got a 3 times great-grandfather in Norwich who was actually convicted for stealing a kitchen sink. No lie. I wonder how we got that out. Isn't that a phrase? You know, he took everything except the kitchen sink. That's what they say about burglaries. Yeah, I remember I got burgled once, and one of my mum was like, oh, they've taken everything except the kitchen sink. Well, this man did take the kitchen sink, so he sounds like he was very thorough. No lie, he got 3 months, but was acquitted a few years later for stealing lead from a roof. And again, you know, we can't, with a lot of these cases, we can't judge our ancestors too harshly, because as I said before, there was back when a lot of these crimes were being committed, there was no safety net for those who fell through the gaps of, you know, society, those who were left destitute. It was either commit an offence, starve, or end up in the workhouse. So you kind of got to put yourself in a lot of these people's shoes when you're reading about these crimes. So we've had one from Megan Ravenhill, who said, in 1790, John Boremaster had to oversee what I've nicknamed in the Duckside Saga. What I've nicknamed the Duckside Saga. There's a very, very funny account when he allowed his sailors to go ashore and stole a farmer's duck and apples from his tree. And the excuses they came up with were, oh, I think I've missed some of that comment off. If you can find the rest of Megan's comment now, I'll pop it in the comments. That did sound quite interesting, but no problem if not. So Cindy Pennington said, oh, a tip. Great, a good tip. So if your ancestors were travellers who often avoided the census, they can sometimes be found in criminal records as they often got moved on. Yes, that is very true. I gave a talk to the Gypsy and Traveller Family History Society about 3 years ago now, and it was a real eye-opener for me because I'd never really done much Gypsy or Traveller research. And that was one of the first things I came across. Look for them in newspapers, but also look for them in criminal records, because they might not necessarily been committing offence. They may have been arrested for vagrancy or something like that. So, yeah, that reminds me, there are all these kinds of antiquated offences that don't exist anymore that you might find in the collection. And being charged for being an incorrigible rogue is one of them. So I just need to get my notes on this so I don't get it wrong. I can't find them. It doesn't matter. Incorrigible rogue was basically when you were being charged for lingering, being unemployed, hanging around. And Cindy Pennington has also said, also, you can lose ancestors in the census if they are in prison. Yes, that is a very good point. If your ancestor is missing from the prison, you're scratching your head thinking, why aren't they there? Maybe check prison registers. If they are, it's often just initials that are recorded when censuses are entered into prisons. That's true. So if you're searching for their full name, you might not find them, and it might be quite tricky. So maybe have a look in the crime records, find where they were, and then look in the census. I had a brick wall for years with one ancestor until another researcher found his conviction in the newspaper records. Yep, another way of finding it. Then I found him in criminal records in another part of the country. Thank you, Cindy. Those are both fantastic tips. And I think I've been going for 40 minutes. I do need to stop soon. Max will kill me when he gets back. Janice Allen has said, my great-great-uncle was the oldest man in Britain to be hanged in 1883 in Worcestershire. Wow. And I had no idea when I started doing family history research. I love stories like this because it proves you have no idea what you're going to find when you start looking. The records at Kew were marvellous, and I found a petition for leniency because of his age. His age was 71. Oh, wow, the Kew records are the ones in our collection. So it might be worth having a look in our collection, Janice, and seeing if those records are now in our crime collection. Leniency, so he was granted leniency because of his advanced age, and also the records signed by the Home Office for his hanging, together with the names and the signatures of all the jury. I was amazed that the jury had to view the body afterwards to confirm that this was the same man they had sent to be hanged. Samuel Crowther murdered his neighbour when he was found in his garden stealing pears. Wow, so I think I got that confused. There were two separate records. But yeah, all these are fantastic examples of why this collection is so fantastically rich and why you should all be searching them. Because the reason I actually decided to talk about them this week was you'll be pleased to know that the the indexed electoral registers that we released about 3 or 4 weeks now. It was before my wedding, so it's quite some time now actually. But they have proven, when we had a look at how they performed, they proved incredibly popular. And as I was looking down the list of how the degree to which certain sets are used, I was quite shocked and saddened at the level of usage the crime records were getting. They were still getting used a lot, but nowhere near as much as I expected, considering how interesting, rich, and useful they genuinely can be. So I'm hoping today's broadcast will inspire you all to get online and start looking for those felonious forebears. And a final thing I'll leave you with as well was, if there are any podcast enthusiasts out there, and well, I know you're all history enthusiasts, but I listen to a fascinating podcast on the history of public executions and crime and punishment by a man called Dan Carlin, who does a really good podcast series called Hardcore History. I warn you, they're very long, most of them about 5 hours long, so you can tell why I love them. He just goes into the most ridiculous levels of detail you could possibly imagine, but he did a very good one called Pain Attainment. It's a bit of a cringy name, but it's basically about the history of executions and corporal punishment, and it's 4.5 hours long. I learned all about the Bloody Code, and a lot of things I mentioned today are things I heard on that. I think you can find it on Spotify, iTunes, all these different places. So I just wanted to give a plug for one of my favourite podcasts, which I'm sure as history enthusiasts you will all like. So yes, I will be back again next Friday. Have wonderful weekends. Enjoy this. If you're watching from the UK, enjoy this lovely autumnal weather. If you're not watching from the UK, thanks for waking up at ungodly hours and tuning in. It's lovely to have you here. I'll be back again next Friday. So happy ancestor hunting, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye. Oh, sorry, I need to do my outro. You can tell I need Max here. Bye-bye. Have lovely weekends.